Still from the Strategic Studies of the Executive Intelligence Review, dated November the 14th, 1997. Although the preconditions for British Israelism were rampant in England, the first formal statement of the ideology did not occur until the 1790s, when Richard Brothers, a Royal Navy officer who had fought against America in the Revolutionary War, began to write that England was not just theoretically the New Jerusalem, but that the English people themselves were descended from the lost tribes of Israel, and that they must restore the temple in Palestine. The time for such theory was not ripe, and Brothers was suspected of being a radical, and was ultimately confined to an insane asylum. Around 1840, however, a decision was made somewhere at the Colonial Office, or the East India Company headquarters, to revive Sarpi's old method of religious manipulation, and the next few years would see the rise of two interrelated cults which would become a major weapon in British foreign policy. First, Irish clergyman John Nelson Darby started publishing texts which he claimed decoded the secrets of the Bible and prophetically laid out the fast-approaching apocalypse. Darby's theories, which we today call pre-millennial dispensationalism, had several striking components. Number one, the millennial kingdom of Christ will sweep away all civilization, and the only people saved will be a tiny group of elect who will be raptured physically into the new kingdom. Two, the evil power in the world is Gog, spelled G-O-G, as identified in Ezekiel, who will sweep down on Israel and begin the end days. Darby confidently identified Gog as Russia. And three, the end will come only when the Scripture is fulfilled and the Jews return to Israel and build the temple. How did the state of Israel come into existence, ladies and gentlemen? Check your history. Almost simultaneously, one John Wilson picked up the theories of Richard Brothers and published Lectures on Our Israelitish Origin in 1840, claiming, also on the evidence of biblical secret knowledge, that the 10 tribes migrated to Europe after the destruction of the Second Temple, primarily turning into Christian Englishmen and Germans. The racially inferior tribes of Judah, said Wilson, remained in Palestine and became the modern Jews, and they believed that and preached that for a long time. And today, they say, policy requirements. Darby's identification of Russia would be crucial to drumming up support for the war against the country which the British would shortly provoke in the Crimea. Wilson's biblically sanctioned friendship with the Germans was also British policy. The fraud of the whole thing is exposed when slightly later British foreign policy turned against the Germans. Immediately, Wilson's organization was factionalized, and it was discovered by the winning faction that the Germans were actually, get this folks, the racial heirs of the Assyrians, the ancient enemy of Israel, and therefore the enemy of British Israel. The Germans, of course, have always claimed descendancy from what they call the Aryans of India. And both Darbyites and the British Israelites provided invaluable assistance in firmly turning the attention of the British population to Palestine and the need for the rebuilding of the temple. The timing was crucial. In 1840, British Foreign Secretary Lord Palmerston had unofficially committed the British Empire to Zionism. That's no secret. I've been telling you that for many, many years. And the creation of a British-controlled entity in Palestine. And that, folks, is the real secret to the creation of the State of Israel in the Middle East. On the one hand, Britain needed to ensure that the increasing chaos in the Ottoman Empire did not invite other great powers from developing influence there. On the other, it needed to protect the land routes to India and its growing colonial empire. This became official policy in 1845. With a colonial office report proposing, quote, the establishment of a Jewish nation in Palestine as a protected state under the guardianship of Great Britain, end quote. Such a state, the report concluded, quote, would place us in a commanding position in the Levant, from whence to check the process of encroachment, to overawe our enemies, and, if necessary, repel their advance, end quote. The Crown's case officer for this project was Anthony Ashley Cooper, the 7th Earl Shaftesbury, a pious oligarch who combined aspects of both the Derbyites and the British Israelites, cleaned them up for general consumption, and became the leading spokesman for a plan to resettle Jews back in Israel. Shaftesbury's High Church version of British Israelism, as well as the various Low Church versions, grew through the 19th century. Queen Victoria's daughter, Princess Alice, became a patroness of the movement. In 1862, the Prince of Wales and future King Edward VII made a tour of the Holy Land, the first English royal to set foot there since 1270. In 1865, Shaftesbury's efforts came to fruition with the founding of the Palestine Exploration Fund, known as PEF, under the official patronage of the Queen. The PEF brought together funding from the Rothschilds and the United Grand Lodge of Freemasons. There's those Freemasons again. Membership ranged from oligarchs to apocalyptic crazies. And again, religion made a brilliant cover for espionage and colonial manipulation. Nominally charged with surveying the Mideast so that the country could be restored by the Jews to its ancient prosperity, the Palestine Expeditionary Force spent its time subverting the Ottoman governor and making the maps that the British Army would use in the area in World War I. One of PEF's leading explorers in Palestine from 1867 to 1870 was General Sir Charles Warren. According to British author Stephen Knight, Warren, who had been Commissioner of London's Metropolitan Police and a Freemason, oversaw the cover-up of the Jack the Ripper murders, protecting both the United Grand Lodge of Freemasons and the fact that the Prince of Wales had had an illegitimate heir by a prostitute. The Chief of Criminal Investigations on the case for Scotland Yard was Sir Robert Anderson, who was a follower of John Nelson Darby. Warren is credited by Masonic sources with virtually rediscovering the project of rebuilding Solomon's Temple. He founded the Quatuor Coronati Lodge 2076, which, under the guise of being the, quote, research lodge, end quote, within the United Grand Lodge of England, has been active to this day, collaborating with Zionists in attempts to create holy war in the Middle East by blowing up the Muslim shrine Haram al-Sharif on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem in order to rebuild Solomon's Temple. Ironically, when the Quatuor Coronati Lodge succeeded in taking over Theosophy, it spun off the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, run by the satanic SIS officer Aleister Crowley, who was a major influence upon the Thule Society that gave birth to Adolf Hitler's movement and much of the intercult belief structure of the Allgemeine SS. If you study the history of Nazi Germany, you'll find that it came right out of the occult lodges of the Thule Society and Freemasonry. In 1919, the 40-odd British Israelite organizations were consolidated into the British Israel World Federation, also known as BIWF, which today spans the British Empire and permeates the United States. The first patrons of the BIWF were the Marchioness of Hertford and Admiral Sir Richard Pierce. This consolidation followed two developments that were the work of British leaders who had been influenced by British Israelism. The first was the 1917 conquest of Palestine and entry into Jerusalem by Field Marshal Lord Allenby, which was intended to achieve a Palestinian mandate for the British Empire at the Versailles Peace Conference. The second, which sought to give an imaginative purpose to a British mandate, was the Balfour Declaration, backing, quote, the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, end quote. The Balfour Declaration was nowhere more joyously celebrated than in the Darbyite and British Israelite congregations in England and America. But the joy had little to do with the Jewish people. Indeed, these people didn't believe that the Jewish people were really the Jews. So why set up a country for people that they did not believe were the Jews to rebuild the Temple of Solomon in order to bring their prophecy to pass and raise them, elevate them to the position of master race with the royal family of England identified as the only direct descendants of the truly holy bloodline with the divine right to rule, related to Jesus Christ, who was also of the house of David. You see how these lies and this manipulation works? While saying that the Jewish people are not really the Jewish people, they want to recreate the state of Israel with the Jewish people that they claim are the subrace. I tell you, ladies and gentlemen, these people are sick. Literally sick, mentally ill. When we look back through history, we find many wars and disasters, plagues and conquests, volcanic eruptions, climatic changes and mass migrations. But, ladies and gentlemen, we find nothing quite like the Great War. 400 years of European intellectual, moral, and technical superiority created and fed the engines of industrialized murder. These forces, in turn, consumed the very social order which had created them. And after 4 years, the self-proclaimed masters of the universe lay broken and bleeding in the wasteland, saved from ultimate extinction only by the interference of the United States and its revolutionary republic. Cultural suicide, perhaps? An apocalypse by any other name, ladies and gentlemen, is still an eschatological event. It's the end of the world for the inhabitants of that world. For example, near the end of the Great War, in September of 1918, the Turkish 12th Army, holding the ridge line in front of Damascus, which included the ancient mound of Medigo, was attacked and destroyed by the combined use of airplanes, tanks, and cavalry. This battle, eerily described in St. John's Revelation, chapter 16, suggests that Armageddon occurred in 1918. Not only is the battle clearly delineated, but it occurred in the midst of the worst plague since the Black Death of the 14th century. Revelation's apocalypse looks much like the history of the 20th century, leading up to one final millenarial explosion. Was the prophecy of Revelation an ongoing process that essentially started sometime before the Great War? Was the 20th century an unfolding of the final book of the Bible? When the Great War finally ended, on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the old world, with its noble and imperial ways, was well and truly dead.